What was the scariest thing that ever happened to you on vacation? Back during the 3-week vacation and training tour through Thailand alongside my professional Muay Thai instructors, we happened to be staying in the coastal region of Krabi. The calendar marked the month of December in the year 2004. One morning, we decided to take an early boat ride about 2 hours out into the open ocean to visit a tiny, completely uninhabited destination called Bamboo Island. Our plan was simple: just spend the day snorkeling around the reefs and hanging out on the pristine beach. Shortly after jumping into the surf, we started noticing a very weird, uncomfortable feeling in the water. It felt exactly like something invisible was constantly stinging our bare skin. So we decided to listen to that chemical red flag and got out of the ocean for a while. As we stood drying off on the sand, a strange, roaring acoustic hum caught our attention. We looked out toward the horizon and noticed, wow, that is a really weird, incredibly loud wave coming in toward us. Our very next logical thought was, wow, that big wave just keeps coming closer. I wonder if that is somehow related to how all the ocean water drastically receded a few minutes ago. The entire shoreline had rapidly pulled back into the deep, making the sandy beach look easily 1,000 feet wider in the blink of an eye. The sheer anomaly of the landscape triggered a massive wave of internal panic. Realizing we were completely exposed on a flat strip of sand, we frantically scrambled toward the jungle and climbed up to the absolute highest geographical point on the tiny island. We sat there, huddled together on the dirt for about 12 agonizing hours. From that volatile vantage point, we watched the next 2 massive tsunami waves violently crash into the island and slowly leave, all while desperately wondering if our high ground was actually going to be high enough to keep us out of the wild, churning waters of the ocean. Those pre-smartphone days were honestly kind of rough. We had 0 signal, no digital notifications, and absolutely no idea what was actually happening to the world around us. After finally being rescued by the Thai Coast Guard and arriving back on the mainland nearly 15 hours later, the curtain of ignorance was lifted. Finding out that roughly 400,000 people had tragically lost their lives across the region was an absolute paralyzing shock to our systems. Overall, that nightmare was not just the scariest vacation moment I have ever experienced, but without a doubt, the single scariest day of my entire life. Cultural note: the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004, triggered by a massive undersea earthquake, remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. In the coastal areas of Thailand, such as Krabi and its surrounding isolated islands, the sudden withdrawal of the shoreline was a critical physical anomaly that preceded the arrival of successive crests, catching thousands of vacationing tourists completely unaware due to the historical lack of local early warning infrastructure and real-time mobile communications during that era. On the way home from a family vacation several years ago, my journey took a sudden, catastrophic turn. As I was driving down the interstate, the weather completely dissolved, and I found myself steering straight through a massive zero-visibility dust storm. The air turned into a thick, blinding wall of brown dirt. Out of nowhere, a strange, suffocating pressure filled the cabin of my truck, and a sudden, intense internal impulse forced me to shift over into the left lane for some unexplainable reason. I immediately pressed the brakes and slowed my speed down to a crawl. Through the shifting haze, I started spotting the chaotic aftermath of a massive 51-car pileup unfolding right before my eyes. I saw several crushed vehicles scattered across the right lane and the right shoulder that were completely fucked. The sound of metal twisting and tires screeching echoed through the wind. I managed to bring my truck to a full stop directly behind a heavily damaged minivan. The vehicle had obviously been hit pretty hard from behind by a larger vehicle, its rear frame completely caved in. I looked closer through the dust and felt a cold wave of adrenaline hit my spine. I saw a small, helpless child standing up right through the jagged edges of the broken rear window, crying out for help. Without even thinking about my own safety, my survival instincts kicked into overdrive. I jumped straight out of my truck cabin and ran through the howling wind to the driver's side of the minivan. The mother was sitting behind the wheel in a state of absolute vegetative shock, staring blankly ahead. The minivan's engine was sills running loudly, which meant the vehicle was a sitting duck for another rear-end collision. I aggressively banged on the glass, yelled at her to snap her out of the paralysis, and quickly verified that the little kid in the back was physically all right. I commanded her to press the gas pedal and drive immediately onto the wide dirt median of the divided highway, completely out of harm's way. I scrambled back to my own vehicle and quickly drove off onto the safety of the grass median as well, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Literally seconds later, a huge commercial truck came flying at high speed through the exact, blinding spot where our two vehicles had just been parked. The massive semi-truck proceeded to violently crash into another stalled car deeper in the dust ahead, sending debris flying everywhere. I know it was incredibly stupid of me to get out of my truck in the middle of a live multi-car pileup, but my quick actions probably saved that poor lady and her young kid from a horrific death. The sheer terror of what could have happened caught up with me later. I suffered from intense, paralyzing nightmares about that specific dust storm for months afterward. Cultural note: dust storms, often referred to as haboobs in arid regions of the United States like Arizona and Texas, are severe meteorological hazards that can reduce highway visibility to absolute zero within seconds. Highway safety protocols explicitly state that during high-density multi-car pileups, motorists should remain inside their vehicles with seatbelts fastened, as stepping onto a live interstate during active collisions carries an extremely high risk of fatal secondary impacts from approaching commercial transport trucks. Back in the year 1995, I spent the entire summer traveling through Europe. The absolute last week of the itinerary was dedicated to solo travel, and I was just a 21-year-old female navigating the foreign continent completely by myself. As a completely broke college student, I took advantage of as many free tourist perks as humanly possible to save cash. With my specialized Euro-Rail pass, I managed to score a free daytime cruise on the scenic Lake Geneva. The excursion ended up being much longer than I initially calculated it would be, and the afternoon turned into a really hot, stifling day. Because of the intense heat, I regularly switched from sitting on the bright, sunny open deck to going inside the air-conditioned cabin several times. After I had manually made that switch a few times, a creeping, uncomfortable pattern caught my attention. I noticed that a random man and woman were precisely mirroring my physical movements across the vessel. Curiously, they were not sitting together or even interacting, acting like complete strangers. I initially thought I was just being overly paranoid, so I decided to test them by moving even more frequently between the decks. But my stomach dropped. The couple followed my every single move like clockwork. Assuming they were predatory and just wanted to take advantage of a young girl traveling completely alone, I decided I would just stay put and let them disembark the vessel first. But my strategy backfired. At the absolute end of the route, the crowd emptied out, and we were the only 3 people left remaining on the entire boat. At this terrifying point, my chest tightened, and I was actually starting to get severely scared. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and all my parents knew back home was that they needed to pick me up at the international airport on Friday. If something horrible happened to me right now, there was absolutely no way for anyone to track my movements, and there would be a communication delay of nearly a full week before anyone even realized I was missing. The isolation felt absolute. Finally, as the boat docked, I noticed a uniformed police officer standing right near the end of the exit ramp. I quickly got off the boat, bypassed the couple, and stood directly next to him, pretending to ask for directions. The strange couple actually hung around the dock area for a bit, staring in my direction, but they finally must have figured out that I wasn't going to leave that officer's side by myself. They slowly walked away into the crowd. I still had about 6 hours until my scheduled train was going to leave the local platform. I had originally planned to do a bit of sightseeing in the beautiful town we were in, but my survival instincts told me to play it safe. I chose to immediately head inside the main train station and stay there, surrounded by other people, until my ride arrived. I have no clue what they truly wanted from me, but I still have absolutely no doubt in my mind that they were up to something dark. Cultural note: Lake Geneva, a massive deep-water lake shared between Switzerland and France, is a major European tourist hub famous for its passenger ferries and steamboat cruises. During the decade of the 90s, long before the widespread availability of mobile internet, GPS tracking, or international smartphones, solo travelers relied heavily on physical URL passes, making them highly vulnerable to coordinated targeting by local syndicates due to the severe difficulty of immediate emergency communication. When I was only 13 years old, I went on an international vacation overseas with my mother. On our very first night at the coastal resort, the severe jet lag completely disrupted our sleep cycles. We both woke up wide awake at around 5 in the morning. Looking out the balcony, the sunrise was absolutely beautiful, and the tropical water looked pristine, so we spontaneously decided to head down to the beach for an early morning swim. Back home, we are used to a very calm, predictable sea with almost no wave action. Because of that structural familiarity, we honestly did not think it was a big deal to jump into the water when there were absolutely no lifeguards on duty. That single naive mistake turned the start of our vacation into a living nightmare. Within just a few minutes of stepping into the surf, the calm water suddenly shifted, and we got violently caught in a massive rip current without even knowing what the phenomenon was. The invisible force was pulling us away from the safety of the sand with incredible speed. My mother was a very weak swimmer, and she exhausted her energy almost immediately trying to fight the tide. Realizing she was sinking, she looked at me with absolute panic in her eyes, let go of my arm, and told me to just swim straight to the shore alone and call for help. But I quickly glanced back at the coastline, and the entire beach was completely empty. There was not a single soul out there at that hour. I knew right then, with a heavy wave of dread in my stomach, that there was no help coming. She just wanted me to leave her behind to save my own life. I absolutely refused to let her go. I swam back against the freezing pressure, grabbed her tightly by the hand, and began to swim sideways as hard as I humanly could, my lungs burning from the effort. It was a desperate, chaotic sprint for survival. Luckily, we were still relatively close to the breaking surf, and my frantic adrenaline rush finally pushed our bodies into a shallow sandbar where we could physically stand up. We dragged ourselves out of the surf, trembling and completely breathless. We stumbled back to our hotel room, feeling an insanely heavy, unnatural sleepiness wash over our bodies from the near-death exhaustion. We collapsed onto the beds and fell into a deep, comatose sleep, finally waking up almost 10 hours later. When we opened the curtains and looked out of the hotel window, a cold sweat broke out across my neck. The midday beach was now packed with tourists, but there were bright, waving red flags planted all along the shoreline, and absolutely no one was swimming in that deceptive water. Cultural note: rip currents are powerful, narrow channels of fast-moving water that flow from the shoreline back into the deep ocean, often forming near structures like piers or breaks in sandbars. International beach resorts utilize a standardized maritime flag warning system where red flags explicitly signify highly hazardous surf conditions, indicating that swimming is strictly prohibited due to severe undertows that can easily overwhelm even experienced swimmers. I have an incredibly interesting yet deeply unsettling story from the decade of the 80s, when I was just a young child. Each summer, my parents took my sister and me to Wildwood, New Jersey for a family vacation, and we always had an absolute blast. Those coastal memories have permanently stayed with me. One particular summer, we checked into our usual highly reputable beachfront hotel, a place where we had comfortably stayed in previous years. Our suite was spacious, featuring a separate living room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a narrow hallway leading directly to the main bedroom. I was probably 7 years old at the time, and I remember the sequence of events perfectly because it absolutely terrified us. On our very first morning, we woke up to find our heavy front door slightly cracked open. This was deeply alarming because my father was meticulous. He always locked the door, turned the deadbolt, and firmly secured the safety chain before we went to sleep. My parents initially brushed it off, thinking one of us kids might have been sleepwalking in an unfamiliar environment. To prevent this, the next night, my father slept in one bed with me, and my mother slept in the other bed with my sister. Both parents intentionally slept on the outer sides of the mattresses to make sure they would instantly wake up if either of us tried to climb out. Yet, against all logic, the front door was wide open again the next morning, the chain dangling loosely. My father immediately went down to the main office to discuss the security issue with the manager. The manager apologized profusely, but explained there were absolutely no other rooms available due to the peak tourist season. To compensate, he gave my dad a much lighter bill for the week and sent a maintenance worker to inspect the locks, which were found to be in perfect working order. That night, my parents decided to take extra precautions. They stacked all of our heavy luggage directly against the front door, creating a solid physical barricade. The next morning, a cold wave of dread hit us. The door was wide open, and the luggage had been violently thrown into the middle of the living room, with one specific item neatly placed on the kitchen table. The following night, growing desperate, my parents manually dragged the heavy wooden kitchen table and wedged it firmly against the door frame. The next morning, the door was open again, and the heavy table had been quietly moved back to its original place without making a single sound. My parents tried to laugh it off to keep us from panicking, but they later admitted they had an unexplainable gut feeling that something was deeply wrong. A creeping, suffocating tension filled the suite. No money was ever taken, and nothing was ever disturbed while we were out at the pool or the beach. Was it an intruder? Was it a ghost? I don't really believe in the supernatural, but the physical reality of that door opening by itself was completely terrifying. We stayed there for a full week, and the strange occurrences didn't begin immediately. It all started on the second night. After the luggage incident, my father thoroughly checked every single corner of the room to see if there was any secret way someone could have entered, but there was no adjoining door or hidden panels. My father insisted he had nothing to do with it, and we completely ruled out carbon monoxide poisoning as a cause. On the third night of the cycle, an unsettling instinct hit me, a sudden, unexplainable urge that told me I needed to keep an eye on the front area. I decided to sleep on the pull-out couch in the main living room, and my dad stayed up right next to me to keep guard. Apparently, Neither of us woke up to any sound during the night, yet our eyes opened at dawn to the exact same sight. The heavy door was cracked open, letting in the cold ocean breeze. Logically, it was probably one of us sleepwalking, perhaps me, as I did used to sleepwalk at random times when I was that exact age. Nothing was ever stolen from our rooms, but the sheer physical strength required to silently move that heavy kitchen table away from a dead-bolted door without waking two adults sleeping nearby is a mystery that my family can never truly explain. I went to Big Bend National Park alongside my husband, our teenage daughter, and her best friend for a family summer vacation. I am honestly no stranger to the brutal desert climate, and I know for a recovery fact that you have to take a massive amount of water with you anywhere you go and be back inside shelter before noon. Period. The day started out incredibly cloudy and cool that morning, so we comfortably hiked the lower Burro Mesa Pour-Off Trail. It was an easy hike, nice, breezy, and fun. We hiked all the way back to our rental car and thought, heck, why don't we just do the upper Burro Mesa Pour-Off Trail since we are already here? Why not? The day sills felt relatively cool, and the sky was sills kind of cloudy. That single casual decision was the worst mistake of my life. We hiked all the way down into the canyon, which was a massive, completely dried-out river floodplain. About halfway down the rocky terrain, a sudden shift in the atmosphere occurred. The protective clouds completely disappeared in a matter of minutes, and the blinding desert heat came out hard, slamming against our bodies. An uncomfortable internal impulse hit my chest, an inexplicable sensation of physical dread that told me we needed to turn back immediately. But we foolishly lingered for a few minutes at the vista point, and then the terrifying realization finally hit us. We were stranded in the absolute middle of a barren desert wasteland, with most of our drinking water completely gone. The air was suffocatingly hot, dry, and we had nothing but a steep uphill climb to hike for several miles. We somehow managed to slowly force our bodies to move back up the trail toward the car. All of us kept completely quiet, not saying out loud what we were all desperately thinking in our minds, that we were going to die out here. Those people reading this account who actually know about the reality of extreme desert heat will probably be having full panic attacks just reading this. We were all of us seeing black stars in our vision, starting to stagger violently on the gravel, and every single step was absolute physical torture. To make the nightmare worse, my daughter's best friend severely sprained her ankle halfway up the steep trail, and there was absolutely zero shade or vegetation in which to rest, and we were entirely out of water. When our boots finally reached the parking lot and we collapsed back inside the car, all of us were almost dead from acute dehydration and severe heat stroke. We drove back to the park basin in a complete daze, and each of us desperately drank over 5 liters of water, and not one of us had to use the bathroom for the rest of the night. Our bodies were completely hollow. My stupid, reckless decision to hike a second trail that morning nearly killed my entire family. We found the park host later that evening, once we had physically recovered, and they told us that another tourist had literally died on that exact same trail just the week before, under the exact same circumstances. It remains without a doubt one of the absolute scariest things that I have ever experienced. Cultural note. Big Bend National Park, located in the Chihuahuan Desert of Texas, features extreme geographical terrain where summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Park rangers frequently document severe cases of heat illness on trails like Burro Mesa due to the phenomenon of thermal radiation from canyon walls and anhidrosis, a critical medical condition where a dehydrated human body completely ceases sweat and urine production to preserve core moisture during a heat stroke. I got absolutely mind-numbingly drunk during a vacation weekend down in New Orleans. The night was winding down, my phone completely died, and I was left with zero battery to call an Uber back to my room. Instead of staying in a crowded place, I made a reckless decision. I could just barely see the high roof of my hotel building from where I was standing, so I just started walking down the unfamiliar streets alone in the dark. As I was stumbling along the pavement, a vehicle pulled up next to me. Two local women inside saw me struggling to walk, rolled down the window, and casually asked if I needed a quick ride. In my heavily impaired state, I thought it was my lucky break. I said sure, told them exactly where I was trying to go, and jumped right into the back seat. It was an obviously idiotic, incredibly dangerous drunk move. The car took off, and within just a few blocks, my internal survival alarms started ringing. I could clearly tell by the street signs that we were absolutely not heading toward my hotel anymore. They were taking completely random turns. The two women immediately started acting very strange, whispering to each other. They began making frantic, hushed phone calls on their devices, and then suddenly pulled into a desolate gas station, claiming they needed to get some gas. The sheer terror of the situation hit me like a physical punch. I was sobering up real quick, as all of this was going down in the middle of nowhere. At the gas station pump, they didn't even touch the fuel nozzle. They just stared at the screen and muttered that the station wouldn't take cash, making up ridiculous excuses, and just aggressively stalling for time. It felt like they were waiting for someone else to arrive. Adrenaline completely took over my body. I managed to quietly slide a $20 bill out of my pocket, dropped it onto the center console between their seats, and luckily yanked the door handle. I burst out of the car, ran with all my might straight inside the bright gas station convenience store, and hid by the counter. I waited there for about 15 minutes, watching them from the glass, until they finally sped off. Once the coast was clear, I took off running at full sprint toward my hotel, navigating the alleys until I made it through the lobby doors safely. I only ever told one single person in my life about this nightmare. To this day, I find myself wondering all the time what horrific things they truly had planned for me in that dark car. Cultural note: safety reports from urban tourist hubs like New Orleans frequently caution visitors against accepting unauthorized transportation from strangers, especially when intoxicated. Criminal networks in high-traffic nightlife districts often utilize tactical distraction schemes, such as stalling at service stations or coordinating via phone calls to facilitate targeted robberies, express kidnappings, or financial extortion of vulnerable travelers. I shared this unique experience online because it actually happened quite recently while my family and I were traveling. I was out snorkeling in the open ocean with my wife and my teenage son during a sunny afternoon excursion. My wife was actually free swimming without the heavy gear, so she comfortably moved ahead of us to explore the reef. Meanwhile, my son and I took our time, gently paddling over toward the main designated snorkeling area. Because of the physical gap, she was probably about 50 yards away from our position. Everyone else in the tourist group was scattered about 30 yards away. The water felt peaceful, and I was casually swimming when suddenly a heavy force started pushing me down into the water. I was completely submerged for a second. I desperately recovered my balance and realized my 17-year-old son, who was already a full-grown man and noticeably bigger than I am, was tightly locking his arms around me. He had accidentally taken a massive amount of salt water into his snorkel tube and started panicking. In his blind fear, his survival instincts kicked in, and he just desperately grabbed onto the nearest solid object, which happened to be me. While I was trying my absolute best to tread water while holding up another heavy adult male, desperately figuring out how I was supposed to navigate us toward a safe reef where we could physically stand up or get back to the main shore. But my muscles immediately started burning. I simply could not manage the dead weight of 2 people at once. I started dipping in and out of the rough water, swallowing fluid, as my arms and legs started getting completely exhausted. I was treading for my son's life, but my own lungs were failing. Finally, during a quick second above the surface, I managed to catch the attention of another nearby snorkeler. I screamed out for help with the last bit of air I had left, and a group of tourists immediately swam over to our position. Someone with a rental paddleboard quickly intercepted my son, pulling him out of the water. Once the pressure was gone, I could only float on my back, paddling as much as I humanly could, while a random dude pulled my limp body toward a nearby transport boat. By the exact time the crew dragged me onto the deck of the little boat, my vision went dark, and I just about passed out on the wood from absolute physical exhaustion. I legitimately thought both my son and I were goners down there. The crazy thing about this nightmare is that we are both highly competent good swimmers. If his brain wasn't completely panicking from the water intake, he could have easily swam back to the shore, which wasn't that far away from our location. Or he could have just cleared the valve, blew the water from his snorkel tube, and continued swimming normally. But since his heavy body was actively pulling me down into the abyss, my own brain started panicking, leaving me unable to think straight or verbally tell him what to do. It was, without a doubt, one of the absolute scariest experiences of my entire life. During my very first trip to Europe, when I was only 7 years old, my family visited the historic city of Brussels. One busy afternoon, my father and I were standing on the concrete platform, waiting for the local subway train to arrive. When the heavy locomotive finally screeched to a halt, the sliding doors opened to reveal a completely packed, suffocating crowd of commuters. Taking one look at the mass of people, my father immediately decided it was not safe to get in, opting to wait for the next ride. But in my 7-year-old mind, I foolishly chose to ignore his caution. Believing my small size would allow me to easily slip through the crowd, a sudden wave of childish overconfidence took over. I stepped right into the packed car. I remember casually turning around to smile at my father, only to realize with a sudden jolt of adrenaline that he was still standing outside on the platform. The train doors abruptly slammed shut, right as his desperate hands reached out to pull me back to safety. Absolute panic immediately took over my entire body. Heavy tears began streaming down my face as the train violently accelerated into the dark tunnel. Through the thick glass of the window, I could hear my father yelling a final frantic command at me. "Get down in the next station." That 3 to 5 minute transit until the train finally reached the next platform was the longest, most agonizing wait of my entire life. My small mind was racing with terrifying thoughts of being permanently lost forever in a foreign country. Luckily, a kind-hearted local man had witnessed the entire tragic situation unfold on the previous platform. Seeing my raw terror, he deliberately got off the train with me at the next stop, guiding my trembling body away from the crowd. We both sat down together on a wooden bench, silently waiting for the next train to arrive from our previous location. We were not even able to speak the same language, but his calm presence kept me from completely losing my mind. My father finally arrived on the very next train, running out of the doors to grab me. It was a horrible, deeply traumatic experience for a child of that age. I thank God for Good Samaritans. If that man had not stepped in, things could have gone really bad. I traveled to Egypt a few years back for a family vacation alongside my grandmother. As I remember the timing, I was only about 15 or 16 years old, which made me incredibly naive and, completely vulnerable to the unfamiliar environment. The first terrifying incident happened on a very quiet afternoon. My grandmother and I were walking slowly down the pavement towards the main hotel where we were stayed, just enjoying the warm weather and the relaxing flow of our day. Suddenly, out of absolute nowhere, a local Egyptian man locked his eyes on me and started to aggressively chase me. He literally ran at full sprint down the crowded street, desperately trying to physically catch my body while screaming at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Stop! You are my wife!" A cold wave of panic rushed over me, and my chest tightened in pure terror. I immediately turned and ran as fast as I could toward the hotel entrance, desperately trying to reach safety. The predatory man did not stop chasing me through the entrance. He only stopped his aggressive pursuit when I slammed my back against the rear wall of the closing elevator, watching the heavy metal doors slide shut right in his face. The second horrific encounter took place during that exact same vacation cycle. My grandmother and I went shopping at some local street stores to buy traditional souvenirs and presents for our friends and relatives back home. We eventually found a little nice-looking shop tucked away in a corner, and there was a pleasant older Egyptian man behind the counter who politely helped us find gifts. We talked a bit about our trip, and he casually mentioned that he also practiced traditional therapeutic massage. He looked at us with a warm smile and said something like, "Give me $1, and I will massage your shoulders with natural oils, only 5 minutes." At that exact age, I was suffering from some severe chronic issues with my neck and shoulders. The tension was so bad that my muscles felt exactly like you were touching a cold stone. Because of this pain, my grandmother massaged me often back at home, so she was completely okay with the price and agreed to pay him for massaging my shoulders. The man did not seem creepy at all at first. He calmly offered to let me choose a scented oil from the shelf and explicitly explained the technique he would use. Okay. We stepped into a slightly shielded area of the shop and he started the process. For about 1 full minute, everything was completely fine, and the pressure actually felt quite good on my frozen muscles. But then, the atmosphere shifted into pure horror. The vendor abruptly decided it was a nice idea to cross an absolute line and violently touch my breasts under my shirt. A sharp surge of pure adrenaline and survival instinct exploded through my entire body. I instantly turned around with full force, punched him dead in the face with my fist, and ran away towards the street. My grandmother immediately stepped in, fiercely protecting me while screaming at the vendor as we fled the premises. Both of those intense situations left me completely terrified for the rest of the trip. I was just a young teenager trying to enjoy a vacation, but those individuals permanently ruined the entire experience for me. Cultural note: travel safety advisories for international tourists in high-traffic commercial districts of Egypt, such as traditional bazaars, frequently include warnings regarding aggressive street merchandising and persistent verbal harassment due to significant cultural disparities and local economic pressures. Solitary female travelers, or small family groups, often report tactical tracking by vendors who utilize high-pressure psychological manipulation or physical boundary violations under the guise of local hospitality or informal service offerings. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. I was traveling completely alone during a backpacking journey through South America, navigating unfamiliar cities on a tight budget. One night, after hanging out late at a local spot, I found myself walking completely by myself at around 3 in the morning, heading back to my rented hostel in Montevideo, Uruguay. The heavy night air was dead silent, and the streetlights threw long, distorted shadows against the old concrete buildings. As I finally approached the absolute last turn before reaching my destination, my eyes caught a tactical trap. There were 3 local guys positioned ahead of me, completely separated in a strategic formation. 2 of them were loitering on one side of the narrow street, while the 3rd guy was standing directly across on the other side. My survival instincts flared instantly. I already felt the immediate physical threat. There was no one else around to help me, and the isolation felt absolute. The moment they noticed my silhouette walking down the block, they didn't scream or aggressively rush toward me. Instead, they coordinated their gaze and started to loudly sing a creepy synchronized song together in the dark. The sound shattered the quiet night. A heavy wave of dread washed over me as I realized how deeply vulnerable I was. To avoid any confrontation, I had to deliberately step off the sidewalk and walk right down the dead center of the asphalt, desperately trying to keep my distance from both sides of the street. The tension was suffocating. When I was finally passing right between them, the lone guy on the right abruptly crossed the street directly behind my back, matching my pace while still singing that twisted melody. In that exact millisecond, I felt an intense physical sensation that I had never experienced before in my entire life. I felt the pure primal instinct of a helpless prey who was actively being hunted by a calculated predator. A horrible, freezing chill violently rushed up my spine, paralyzing my breath. Adrenaline took over my muscles, and I just kept on walking as fast as I humanly could, staring straight ahead until I finally reached the heavy wooden doors of my hostel. They didn't physically assault me or grab my backpack. They didn't do anything other than psychologically terrorizing me on purpose for their own amusement. Once I was safely locked inside my room, the emotional dam broke. I hid under the sheets and cried all night long, severely questioning my own sanity and wondering if it was actually a good idea to continue my solo backpacking journey through the continent. Up until that exact point, I had absolutely no problem walking on the streets of other local neighborhoods late at night. I was not feeling unsafe or paranoid during my vacation until that terrifying psychological trap fundamentally changed how I viewed the dark. This happened during my very first year living abroad in China, back in the year 2002. I was only a 19-year-old female at the time, completely vulnerable and unfamiliar with the region. I was staying in the northeastern sector of the country, in the absolute dead of winter, a brutal geographic area located not too far from the freezing borders of Siberia. To make matters worse, I did not speak a single word of Mandarin back then. One afternoon, myself and some other foreign kids decided to take a short weekend trip. Our plan was to take a 3-hour night train to a nearby city just to check it out and do some sightseeing, hoping to enjoy our winter vacation. The trains in that specific era were a complete shock to our system. They were basically like packed cattle cars, masses of people squeezed together wall to wall, filled with thick smoke and lots of aggressive, loud yelling. There was absolutely no digital sign or visual indicator inside the carriage to let you know when you finally reached your destination. Instead, a train employee would periodically shove his way into the crowded car and violently scream the name of the next stop over the deafening mechanical noise. Well, because of the chaotic environment, none of us heard a thing when the name of our specific stop was called out. We only realized we might have completely missed our destination when we glanced at our watches and noticed we had been riding the train for over an hour longer than the entire trip was originally supposed to take. Panic slowly setting in, we cautiously approached a train staff member. We tried our absolute best to explain our precarious situation using frantic hand gestures, repeating the name of the city we were going to over and over again. He looked at us, sighed, and pointed aggressively back the way we came, indicating that we were indeed supposed to get off the train several stations back. Then, he gestured at us to wait by the door. When the locomotive finally screeched to a halt at the next unknown stop, he called over some random local guy. We had absolutely no idea who this man was, and motioned for us to follow him. The stranger led our small group off the passenger car, and we suddenly emerged into an empty, dead silent, snowy train yard. The wind was howling, and the temperature was below freezing. The guy started walking up and down the massive rows of parked locomotives, we presumed trying to manually find a specific train that was heading back the way we came. All of us were nervously trudging along right behind him in the deep snow, our boots freezing. All of a sudden, the heavy metal door of a concrete building near the tracks bursts wide open. Two military uniformed guards bolt out into the snow, sprinting directly toward our position while screaming at the top of their lungs. Before we could even process the threat, they grabbed our guide and violently hit him right in the mouth. The poor man was immediately cowering, visibly trembling, and apologizing while talking a mile a minute in Mandarin. We had absolutely no idea what was going on, but the physical violence made it seem like a very bad, high-stakes situation. A terrifying realization suddenly dawns on us. Absolutely no one in the world has any idea where we are. We don't even know where we are. This was a time before international cell phones or GPS. If we suddenly disappeared out there, or if something horrific happened to us in that dark yard, no one would ever find our bodies. Our parents and our university would look for us in the tourist city we were supposed to be in, not way out in the middle of a desolate, frozen wasteland. The guards aggressively marched our group into a full-on underground military interrogation room. The atmosphere was terrifying. One single bare light bulb hung on a dirty string from the concrete ceiling. The space featured damp cement walls, heavily barred windows, and a cold metal desk. They immediately started yelling directly at our faces, their voices booming, but we didn't know a single word of what they were saying. Then they turned around and started screaming at our guide. The poor man was obviously scared out of his mind, desperately crying and trying to explain the misunderstanding. This psychological torture went on for a grueling hour. They point at us and yell, they point at him and yell, and they violently bang their fists against the metal desk to break our resolve. Next, they force us to completely dump out all our bags, meticulously going through our personal stuff, electronics and papers. We genuinely think we are about to get tossed into a remote gulag, never to be heard from again, because maybe their military brains think we are foreign spies sneaking around their infrastructure. Turns out, after a bilingual official finally arrived, we learned the truth. They just thought we were trying to sneak around the secure perimeter, because we were trying to dodge paying the return train fare, which was a whopping 8 RMB, amounting to roughly $1. I stayed in China for many years after that vacation nightmare and rode many trains, so I understood later that we were technically supposed to go inside the main passenger station, buy another official ticket, and go back through the security check-in. We were just dumb, naive kids blindly following a random stranger around. It wasn't his fault either. My guess is that the original train employee probably just told him to find us a quick return train, and looking back as an adult, I fully understand why the guards were so incredibly mad. That snowy yard was a highly restricted, non-passenger military sector, and civilians were absolutely not supposed to be out there under any circumstances, though a punch in the mouth was definitely complete overkill. Still, it is insane to think that we faced an entire military interrogation over a single dollar. Once the misunderstanding was clear, we couldn't get our leather wallets out fast enough. As soon as we handed over the cash, the guards immediately chilled out. They didn't even try to extort any more money out of us except the literal cost of the train fare. Then, they completely changed their demeanor, smiled, and politely helped put us back on the right passenger train heading home. Cultural note: in the early 2000s, China's railway network, overseen by the Ministry of Railways, maintained strict paramilitary security protocols, particularly in northeastern regions near international borders. Areas like train yards and maintenance depots were classified as restricted zones due to strategic transport regulations, meaning unauthorized entry by foreign nationals was treated as a severe security breach, often involving immediate detention by railway police before the financial context of a missing ticket could be established. I went on a relaxing beach vacation a few summers ago, looking forward to completely unwinding. One hot afternoon, I rented a small plastic pedal boat from the resort dock and slowly drifted out into the calm coastal water just to relax. The gentle rocking of the waves combined with the intense heat completely knocked me out. I accidentally fell into a deep, heavy sleep right there on the plastic seat. When my eyes finally snapped open a few hours later, my throat was completely parched. I looked around, and a massive wave of internal dread hit my stomach. I was floating in the absolute middle of nowhere. The resort shoreline was just a tiny, unrecognizable blur on the distant horizon. I was entirely alone on the open ocean, suffering from severe acute dehydration, and I had absolutely no fresh drinking water with me on the small vessel. A sharp physical impulse hit my chest, an unexplainable surge of pure survival instinct that forced me to suppress the rising panic and evaluate my limited resources. Luckily enough, I was wearing a traditional analog watch on my wrist, so I was able to use the position of the sun in the hands of the clock to mathematically figure out exactly where north was. Furthermore, there was a small faded plastic sticker pasted onto the console of the pedal boat that featured some sort of basic geographical map of the local bay. Combining the map with my watch, I managed to figure out the general direction of the coast. I immediately gripped the steering handle and began pedaling with all the physical strength I had left. It was an exhausting, brutal struggle against the shifting current. I finally managed to navigate the heavy plastic boat back to the resort dock exactly at sunset, after pedaling continuously for a little over an hour. My leg muscles were trembling and burning from the extreme exertion. The very first thing I did upon hitting the shore was break straight into the resort's main indoor restaurant. The staff members were actively setting the tables and getting things ready for the heavy dinner service. I burst through the glass doors wearing absolutely nothing but my wet swimsuit, covered in salt crust, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Water! I want water!" I absolutely loved the fact that nobody in the room asked stupid questions or tried to stop me with bureaucratic rules like, "Sir, you can't be inside this facility right now." The lead receptionist who was managing the floor immediately realized something was deeply wrong by the look of raw terror in my eyes. She ran straight to the industrial fridge and brought me some cold bottles of a local Gatorade equivalent. There were a couple of distinct times out on that open water that I was pretty sure I was going to die alone. My brain was short-circuiting from the heat, and I kept thinking to myself, "Dude, I can't believe I'm going to die like a fucking asshole out here." It started getting incredibly scary towards the very end of the ordeal, because the twilight was fading fast, the sky was getting dark, and there were absolutely no safety lights turned on along the distant beach. I was pedaling so slowly due to my physical exhaustion, and I was absolutely terrified that I would completely lose track of where I was going in the pitch-black night. Cultural note: analog watches can be utilized as a rudimentary survival compass in the northern hemisphere by pointing the hour hand directly at the sun. The point halfway between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock mark indicates due south. allowing lost mariners to establish basic orientation. Maritime safety protocols strongly advise recreational tourists against using pedal boats or small non-motorized craft without carrying basic communication devices or personal flotation units, as offshore winds can rapidly displace light vessels into deep water channels. I had been on a grueling international tour with a professional band for a full month. My final itinerary required me to fly straight from the United Kingdom to Qatar, and then finally into Dubai to manage our performance at the Dubai International Jazz Festival. Upon arrival, our entire crew checked into the official host hotel for the event. This was completely standard procedure for high-profile musical acts. However, the moment we crossed the lobby, a strange atmosphere hit me. The massive concrete building was absolutely packed with dozens of silent men dressed heavily in the traditional national clothing of the region. Considering that this was supposed to be a highly secular international jazz festival, I found the overwhelming presence of these men a little odd. As the band manager, I was required to be on site for a solid week before the festival even opened to oversee technical rehearsals. Curiously, during that entire preparation week, I never saw a single one of those men in national dress anywhere near the actual festival site or the outdoor stages. They stayed entirely inside our lodging facility, observing the crowds. We successfully completed the concert cycle and finally went down to check out of our rooms. While waiting in the lobby, I noticed a local newspaper sitting on a coffee table that featured multiple photographs of men and one lone woman plastered across the front page. However, the entire publication was printed in Arabic, so I couldn't read a single word of the text. I casually scanned the images and noticed that the lone woman on the front page oddly resembled my own facial structure. We grabbed our luggage, took a taxi to the international airport, and I immediately headed straight to a newsstand to purchase an English-language version of the newspaper to pass the time. As I sat in the terminal reading the headlines, a wave of pure dread washed over my body. I realized that a high-level political figure from a prominent regional organization had been covertly assassinated inside our exact hotel on the very day we checked in. The reason there were over 70 men in national dress patrolling the corridors was because they were basically the elite federal intelligence agents of the country, operating a full-scale lockdown. Think of it, exactly like the head of the Central Intelligence Agency being assassinated inside a luxury hotel in the United States. It caused an absolute international furor. I don't want to get any more specific regarding the names, because it is highly possible to identify my real identity. To completely confirm my suspicions that I wasn't just dreaming a nightmare, the newspaper literally featured a clear photograph of our exact hotel room door. They also printed a surveillance photograph of that mysterious woman standing next to the men they identified as the operational cell inside the main elevator. So I knew for an absolute fact it was our hotel, and the realization was terrifying. I was just quietly reading this paper inside the secure boarding lounge when suddenly my name was blasted over the intercom, calling me up to the front desk. As I approached the counter, I was immediately surrounded by several very large, imposing men inspecting my passport with intense scrutiny. All of a sudden, a group of multiple tactical officers came running down the narrow gangway leading straight to where the plane was waiting on the tarmac. They were all dressed in full military combat uniforms, and they were carrying heavy machine guns. They aggressively grabbed my arms, and a tiny woman dressed in a traditional black hijab and abaya walked out of the crowd, looking me dead in the eye. She told me in a cold tone that I needed to come with her immediately. I didn't argue for a single second. Neither did the guys in the band, as I had explicitly told them during our travel briefing to never mess with airport security in Dubai. They marched me into a small windowless concrete room, and the woman in the hijab quickly shooed all the armed guards out into the corridor. Acting as the lead interrogator, she sat across from me at a metal desk and started aggressively asking me heavy questions through a translator. How long have you been living in the United Kingdom? What are your exact political affiliations? What was your true purpose for coming to Dubai? What is your religion? Do you harbor any personal animosity towards Muslims? So many rapid-fire questions. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but I answered every single one of them with absolute honesty, keeping my composure. The interrogator finally shook her head in disbelief, loudly knocked on the heavy door, and the guards immediately let me go without another word. Evidently, due to a terrifying fluke of genetics, I remarkably resembled the exact physical profile of one of the specialized operatives who had assassinated that political figure. Furthermore, I had spent the exact same amount of time traveling through the United Kingdom as she had while she was actively trying to cover her tracks, since she had originally traveled all the way from Ireland to execute the hit. I later found out these terrifying details via some high-level contacts involved in the music festival management, because my sudden military detention almost caused a massive international diplomatic incident between our governments. Needless to say, I always thoroughly read the local newspapers whenever I travel internationally now, and I always find someone to translate the text for me if I think there is something weird going on around my hotel. Cultural note: the Dubai International Jazz Festival is a prominent annual music event that draws thousands of Western tourists and global artists to the United Arab Emirates. Due to the complex geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East, high-profile hospitality venues hosting international events maintain strict under-the-radar intelligence monitoring, where local state security departments utilize advanced biometric surveillance and rapid response tactical units at international transport hubs to intercept individuals matching specialized federal watch lists. I was on a standard spring break vacation with my 2 young kids and my elderly parents at the beach about 4 years ago. The afternoon was beautifully sunny, and I was casually laying on a towel on the warm sand while my kids were peacefully playing right next to me, building castles. My parents had already packed up their chairs and gone back to our rented beachfront condo to rest. As I am laying there under the sun, I am lazily listening to and watching the rowdy group situated directly behind my position. It was a large, energetic group of co-ed college cheerleaders, as well as another separate family group of adults traveling with 2 small kids. Out of nowhere, the cheerleaders started doing impressive flips on the open sand, executing some of their advanced training routines. The acrobatic display quickly caught the attention of the adults in the group next to them. It also caught my attention, so I turned my torso to watch the show. As I am observing them laughing, the adults playfully ask the cheerleaders to show them how to properly execute a flip. The college kids oblige, and they start showing the older adults how to do basic tumbling tricks. As the adults start practicing and laughing on the sand, their distraction was absolute. Suddenly, my heart dropped. I remember distinctly hearing one of the mothers say in a trembling voice, "Where did the kids go? Oh my God, they're in the water!" I immediately snapped my head up, my internal alarm screaming. I verified that my own kids were exactly where they should be on the sand, and then I realized that the 2 tiny kids belonging to that distracted group of adults had wandered off to the surf line. They had been violently sucked pretty far out into the ocean, caught completely helpless inside a massive churning current. I did not hesitate. I turned to my own babies, firmly commanded them to stay put, and told them, "Do not move." And then I ran. I sprinted toward the crashing waves and plunged straight into the foaming water, desperate to reach the drowning children. But the ocean floor dropped aggressively. The very millisecond my feet completely stopped touching the solid ground, a heavy wave of dread hit my stomach. I realized that I, too, would be in serious trouble within seconds, and I was about to drown right in front of my own helpless kids. A sharp physical gut instinct hit my chest, an unexplainable internal impulse that forced me to calculate the cold reality of the situation. While I would gladly do as much as I humanly could as long as my feet were touching the ground to save those kids, I absolutely refused to drown in the abyss in front of my own flesh and blood. So I turned my body around and started frantically swimming back toward the shallow shelf. As soon as my feet hit the solid sandbar again, I wiped the salt water from my eyes and found myself standing face to face with one of the mothers from that group, who had finally managed to make it over to the surf. She looked at me, begging with her eyes for me to swim back out into the deep channel. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice breaking, and said, "I am sorry. I can't. My babies are right here on the shore and they can see me. I am sorry." She just stared back at me in total silence, and she didn't say a single word. I will honestly never forget that empty, devastating look of judgment on her face. I scrambled out of the breaking surf, ran onto the dry sand, and started screaming at the top of my lungs at the growing crowd that had started forming, begging that I needed strong swimmers for a rescue. The passing seconds felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, a random guy came running up the beach, carrying a brightly colored foam rescue float, and he violently threw it out into the moving current. I turned back around toward the horizon, and that is when I saw an older vacationing couple heroically dragging one of the small children through the rough water. They were struggling hard against the undertow, their faces pale from exhaustion. I immediately waded back into the surf, moving as far out as I could go without my feet getting swept out from under my body. I stretched my arms out, grabbed the crying little girl from their slipping grip, and told her firmly, "I got you. Just hang on. You gotta hold on for just a second longer." I hauled her small body back up onto the safe ground and gave her to one of the frantic adults from her group. She was absolutely terrified, shivering, and coughing up water, but she was physically okay. I turned back to the dark water a second time, and that is when I saw the true horror of the situation. Two of the adult men from the family group had managed to swim out to where the little boy was drifting, and they were all three struggling hard for survival. The two men were desperately trying to keep their composure to avoid worsening the panic, but I could see the absolute terror of impending death inside their eyes. The poor little boy was screaming, "I don't want to die, I am going to drown," and all sorts of heartbreaking things. His head was violently dipping in and out of the black water, and the two men were exhausting their last muscles trying to keep his chin above the surface, while the current was actively dragging them under too. They were breathing heavily, trying to reassure the kid, but the boy was just freaking out and constantly taking in large amounts of salt water. Suddenly, that damn foam float that the bystander had thrown in finally drifted right into their sector. The boy was able to desperately grab onto the material, and that same heroic older couple had made it back out to assist all three of them. They formed a human chain, fought the current back to my position in the shallows, and we all walked to the safety of the shore together. The boy was shaken as hell, as were all the adults involved, but he was alive and okay, all things considered. I walked over and tightly hugged the older couple who had risked their lives in the water with me. I remember I looked at the woman, tears in my eyes, and told her that I was so deeply sorry that I just couldn't go farther out into the deep channel because my own kids were watching from the shore. She looked at me softly, squeezed my arm, and told me she completely understood a mother's instinct. I will never forget that brave couple's faces for the rest of my days. I walked back to my own kids, who had witnessed the entire life or death struggle from their blanket, but they were somehow blissfully unaware of the absolute severity of what had just unfolded. I packed our gear in a daze, kept my mouth shut, and just got us back to our condo as quickly as humanly possible. All of that intense horror happened in the span of maybe 5 minutes at most, completely ruining the peace of our vacation. Phew! I haven't gone into that kind of raw detail about that traumatic experience ever since it happened. Thanks for making it to the end of my story. Cultural note. Rip currents are specialized, high-velocity coastal hazards capable of pulling swimmers away from the shoreline at speeds of up to 8 feet per second, which is faster than an Olympic swimmer. Maritime rescue statistics indicate that a high percentage of tourist drownings occur during family vacations due to the active drowning response of victims and the phenomenon of bystander distraction, where brief lapses in parental supervision during recreational activities allow children to enter hazardous surf unnoticed. Back in the month of January in the year 1971, my close friend and I were traveling across the Middle East. We were walking down a narrow street toward the local public hammam in the historic city of Mashhad, Iran, right after crossing the foreign border from Herat, Afghanistan. The winter air was absolutely freezing, and the night layout felt completely unfamiliar. Out of nowhere, we began to be targeted and closely followed by a hostile gang of local teenagers and small kids who started chanting, "Hippie American," at our faces. We cautiously looked behind our shoulders, and the view triggered a sudden surge of physical adrenaline. Several members of the mob were aggressively holding up bright, burning torches. The atmosphere shifted from basic harassment to a volatile threat. They began violently throwing heavy garbage and chunks of frozen human excrement at our bodies as we picked up our pace, desperately trying to find an escape route. We quickly turned a sharp corner, hoping to lose them, only to find our boots frozen in place. We were trapped inside a dark, completely sealed dead-end alley. We both looked at each other in total silence, and without exchanging a single verbal word, an unexplainable internal impulse took over our muscles. As a single unit, we spun our bodies around and charged at full sprint straight toward the entrance of the alley. The group of about a dozen attackers turned the corner at that exact millisecond. We burst right through the center of their formation, wildly punching and kicking anyone in our way to break their line. We blindly ran as fast as our legs could humanly carry us down the dark pavement, until we finally emerged into a major commercial area we recognized, and then sprinted all the way back to the safety of our rented room. Looking back at that nightmare, I distinctly remember being struck by a bizarre technical detail. The burning torches they were wielding were actually thick cardboard tubes, the exact kind that wall-to-wall carpet would be rolled on during manufacturing. It is honestly funny what random things go through your mind in moments of extreme physical stress. I won't say that time completely slowed down, but my brain did have enough space to notice that cardboard texture and to strategically choose the smallest kid in the mob to hit first to clear my path. I was only 17 years old at the time, probably only a few years older than the kids chasing us, but that single encounter completely redefined the danger of international travel for me. Cultural note. Mashhad, located in northeastern Iran, was a major historical transit hub along the famous Hippie Trail, an overland travel route utilized by thousands of Western youth during the decades of the 60s and 70s. Due to growing socio-political tensions and anti-Western sentiment prior to the 1979 revolution, young foreign travelers frequently encountered localized hostility, where traditional religious communities reacted aggressively to the perceived countercultural lifestyle of incoming tourists. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.